from her Republican colleagues, she refused to call Snowden a traitor. Now, speaking of China, when asked about TikTok at her confirmation hearing, she refused to acknowledge the threat posed by China owning a social media company that reaches 170 million Americans. And all the way up until she was nominated to be DNI, she publicly advocated for the wholesale elimination of FISA 702. 702 is a tool that we use actively in the intelligence domain, a tool that contributes literally 60% of the information that makes up the president's daily brief. That daily brief, which will also fall under her responsibility, should you be confirmed. The environment facing a new DNI today is complicated and fraught with challenges. Not only had the traditional threats persisted, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, but we've seen an increased threats from terrorism, cyber actions, and transnational criminal organizations. All the while, the intelligence community itself is under attack. Some of our most senior and experienced law enforcement and intelligence professionals are being asked to take political litmus tests. And those who are seen as insignificantly loyal are being fired or forced to resign. Whole agencies are being eliminated and funding impounded in flagrant defiance of the Constitution, which only gives the Congress, us here in this body, the power of the purse. And unvetted, unqualified individuals illegally burrowing into classified and sensitive information, this very action jeopardizing our national security and violating Americans' privacy. These Doge Bros seem to have no restriction on them at all, and I've seen no evidence that Ms. Gabbard is prepared to deal with this onslaught. Therefore, I must oppose her nomination and urge my colleagues to do the same.
Mr. President.
Senator from Idaho.
Thank you, Mr. President. In a moment, the Senate will proceed to a cloture vote on the nomination of Robert F. Kennedy, Jr. to be Secretary of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. I rise to encourage my colleagues to support this motion. As Secretary of HHS, Mr. Kennedy would oversee our nation's expansive healthcare system, from sources of coverage to advancement of public health. Mr. Kennedy's decades of experience and deep drive to advocate on behalf of consumers will set a patient-centered tone at the department. As he has demonstrated in both public and private settings, Mr. Kennedy is committed to reorienting our healthcare approach and restoring faith in our institutions. His passion for addressing America's chronic disease epidemic will save lives, reduce costs, and establish a foundation for a healthier, stronger country. His dedication to transparency will empower patients to make more informed decisions about their health care and form a responsive rapport with Congress. As Mr. Kennedy stated during his hearing, if Congress asks me for information, you will get it immediately. Over the course of his vetting process, Mr. Kennedy met with dozens of members on both sides of the aisle, spoke with bipartisan Senate Finance Committee staff, appeared before 2 committee hearings, and answered over 900 questions for the record, not to mention presenting thousands of pages of documents. Mr. Kennedy has gone through the same Office of Government Ethics process as all nominees who come before the Finance Committee and has received support for his efforts. Similar to all other nominees, we have a letter from the Director of the Office of Government Ethics stating, based thereon, we believe that this nominee is in compliance with applicable laws and regulations governing conflicts of interest. He even amended his ethics agreement, going beyond what was required by the Office of Government Ethics in response to the request from one of our Finance Committee members. I urge my colleagues to join me in advancing this nomination so we can begin to make our country healthier. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Should I do it or not?
President,
Democratic leader.
I know I spoke a little while ago on Tulsi Gabbard, but I feel so strongly I just wanted to make one last plea to my Republican colleagues. In a moment, the Senate will vote to confirm Tulsi Gabbard as the next Director of National Intelligence. Every single Democrat, I am really proud to say, will oppose this awful nomination, because we simply cannot, in good conscience, trust our most classified secrets to someone who echoes Russian propaganda and falls for conspiracy theories. It's hard to believe, of all the talented and capable people, that this is the person nominated. It's a person who has said things like the Ukraine invasion was caused by the United States, not by Putin. It's somebody who has denied Assad's use of chemical weapons despite all of the intelligence. It's someone who echoes Russian propaganda and falls for crazy conspiracy theories. I'd say to my Republican colleagues, please think once again about this nomination. This endangers our security. And my guess is, if a secret ballot were cast on Tulsi Gabbard, maybe she'd get 10 votes. You all know how bad she is. And so I know that people feel they want to please the president in his nomination. But there are certain times you have to buck and stand up and say, no, this is just a very bad choice for America. And the nomination of Ms. Gabbard is simply one of those. I plead with my colleagues, I know it's the last minute, to think twice, to vote no, as we all will vote, because this is such an awful nomination who will endanger our national security and our intelligence operations throughout the country and the world. I yield the floor. Absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks.
Mr. President,
Senator from Oregon.
I rise to oppose the nomination of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to be the
Senate quorum call.
vacate the quorum call.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I rise today to oppose the nomination of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to be the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services. And let me put it very bluntly to my colleagues. A vote for Robert Kennedy for this position is a vote for a sicker America. And there's irony in that judgment, considering Mr. Kennedy is the figurehead of a mass movement known as Make America Healthy Again. But on issue after issue, Mr. Kennedy refused to stand up for policies that will keep Americans healthy and out of the hospital. From vaccines to affordable health insurance to lower drug prices to women's reproductive health care, Mr. Kennedy, through several hearings, ducked and dodged and weaved instead of answering the basic questions that came from senators of both parties. When he did answer, he demonstrated a shocking lack of knowledge about the federal health programs he'll be charged with running and a willful desire to mislead senators about his views on science matters like vaccine safety. The only conclusion I'm left with is that he stands steadfastly by the outlandish views he's expressed over his two-decade career as an anti-vaccine crusader, and he's fully prepared to implement the Republican health care agenda. That agenda boils down to putting big pharma and insurance companies back in charge while leaving millions of American families to fend for themselves without affordable care. And I want to be clear about this. Going back to my days as director of the Gray Panthers, which is what I did before I went into public service, I can just tell you, Mr. President, this is the least qualified nominee to ever be nominated for a position of this importance. So for the next day and night, Senate Democrats are going to be out on this floor telling the American people why. Our colleagues on the other side of the aisle still have an opportunity to turn away from a dangerous path. If they do not, my view is their legacy will be tarnished by setbacks in science that will echo in America for decades. As I mentioned, I spent countless hours as a young man working with seniors to navigate the newly created Medicare program and help them avoid predatory insurance company tactics that remain all too common today. To me and many other Americans, healthcare colleagues is the most important issue, because if you and your loved ones don't have their health, everything else goes by the board. And the reality is, we need to make sure that Americans have the best and most affordable health care possible, rather than having a handful of health care companies being gobbled up in the entire market for health insurance, pharmaceuticals, hospitals, and even doctors. The results have been great for shareholder profits and disastrous for American families. Costs keep climbing. The act of getting a doctor's appointment or filing an insurance claim seems to have become an Olympic sport in much of America. The system delays and denies care and rakes in profits while patients are left wondering how they're going to get the care they need. So the question before the Senate now is whether we want America's chief health officer to be somebody who's going to take on those corporate interests, somebody who's going to fight tooth and nail to lower costs and improve care, somebody who's going to work to protect and improve the federal health care programs that tens of millions of Americans rely on them, and not gut. Everything I've seen and heard from Mr. Kennedy over these last few weeks has led me, colleagues, to conclude he is not the person that America needs. Americans have little reason to take Mr. Kennedy at his word. They do, however, have every reason to believe Mr. Kennedy will continue to embrace and amplify anti-vaccine programs. Every reason to believe is he will back up Donald Trump's abortion bans, and every reason exists to examine the prospect that he'll be a rubber stamp for the Republican health agenda that would rip away the health care of so many Americans. Over the next 24 hours, Democrats are going to show the American people why these concerns are so serious. I yield the floor, and I urge my colleagues to oppose this nomination.
Right now. All time has expired. The question occurs on the Gabbard nomination. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Banks, Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Ms. Blunt Rochester. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Brett. Mr. Budd. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Curtis. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Ms. Ernst. Mr. Fetterman. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Gallego. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Haggerty. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Hickenlooper. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Husted. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Justice. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kim. Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Markey. Mr. Marshall. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McCormick. Mr. Merkley. Mrs. Moody. Mr. Moran.
Jim, are you still going back and forth every day?
No, I spent the night last night here. And,
Mr. Moreno.
back and forth enough.
Mr. Mullen.
Too much.
Ms. Markowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Padilla. Mr. Paul. Mr. Peters. Mr. Reed. Mr. Ricketts. Mr. Risch. Ms. Rosen. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Sanders.
I know, I don't want to hear it. Come over here, I'll tell you all about it.
Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schiff. Mr. Schmidt. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott of Florida. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Sheehy. Ms. Slotkin. Ms. Smith. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Thune. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Tuberville. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warnock. Ms. Warren. Mr. Welch. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Banks, Barrasso, Blackburn, Britt, Budd, Cassidy, Cotton, Crapo, Curtis, Daines, Grassley, Johnson, Justice, Lankford, Moran, Mullen, Risch, Rounds, Schmidt, Scott of South Carolina, Sheehy, Tillis, Tuberville. Mr. Hoeven, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Also Brooks, Coons, Hassan, Heinrich, Kim, Klobuchar, Lujan, Murray, Peters, Schumer, Shaheen, Van Hollen, Wyden. Mr. McCormick? Aye. Mr. Ricketts? Aye. Mrs. Hyde-Smith? Aye. Mrs. Fisher? Aye. Mr. Schiff? No. Mr. Bozeman? Aye. Mr. Schatz? No. Mr. Marshall? Aye. Mr. Gallego? No. Mr. Thune? Mr. Thune, aye. Ms. Duckworth? Ms. Duckworth, no. Ms. Ernst? Ms. Ernst, aye. Ms. Collins? Ms. Collins, aye. Ms. Hirono? No. Mr. Merkley? No. Ms. Cortez Masto? No. Mr. Ossoff? Mr. Ossoff? No. Mr. Welch? Mr. Welch? No. Ms. Baldwin? Ms. Baldwin, no. Ms. Cantwell, no. Mr. Kelly, no. Mr. Graham, aye. Mrs. Moody, aye. Mr. Warner, no. Ms. Lummis, aye. Ms. Blunt Rochester, no. Mr. Husted, aye. Ms. Slotkin, no. Mrs. Capito, aye. Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Blumenthal, no. Mr. Scott of Florida, aye. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Hickenlooper, no. Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sanders, no. Mr. Cornyn, aye. Mr. King, no. Mr. Reed, no. Mr. Markey, no. Ms. Warren, no. Mr. Kramer, aye. Mr. Paul, aye. Mr. Fetterman, no. Mr. Wicker, aye. Mr. McConnell, no. Mr. Moreno, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand, no. Mr. Whitehouse, no. Mr. Booker, no. Mr. Kane, no. Miss Rosen, no. Mr. Durbin, no. Mr. Warnock, no. Ms. Smith, no. Mr. Kennedy, aye. Mr. Haggerty, aye. Mr. Lee, aye. Mr. Cruz, aye. Mr. Padilla, no. Mr. Young, aye. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Bennett, no.
It's like a fine enough state.
Mr. Hawley, aye.
Okay. Yeas are 52, nays are 48. Nomination is confirmed. Under the previous order, the motion to reconsider is considered, made, and laid upon the table, and the President will immediately notify of the Senate's actions.
Mr. President, I move
Majority Leader.
I move to waive the mandatory quorum with respect to the Kennedy nomination.
Is there objection? Without objection. The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on the nomination of Robert F. Kennedy, Jr. of California to be Secretary of Health and Human Services. signed by 17 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. A quorum is present. The question, what you want to do? The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the nomination of Robert F. Kennedy, Jr. of California to be Secretary of Health and Human Services shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Alsobrooks, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Banks, Mr. Barrasso. Aye.
Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Thank you. Mr. Blumenthal, Ms. Blunt Rochester. Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Britt, Mr. Budd, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, thank you, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Curtis, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mr. Fetterman, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gallego, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Mr. Ono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Husted, Mrs. Hyde-Smith. I did not, thank you. Mr. Johnson, Mr. Justice, Mr. Kane.
No, yes.
Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Kim, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford. Thanks. Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. McCormick, Mr. Merkley, Mrs. Moody, Mr. Moran, Mr. Moreno, Mr. Mullen, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schiff, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Sheehy, Ms. Slotkin, Ms. Smith, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young, Senators voting in the affirmative: Banks, Barrasso, Capito, Kramer, Curtis, Fisher, Haggerty, Hawley, Husted, Justice, Kennedy, Lee, McConnell, McCormick, Moran, Moreno, Mullen, Murkowski, Paul, Ricketts, Scott of Florida, Sheehy, Thune, Tillis, and Tuberville. Ms. Collins, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Thank you. Also Brooks, Bennett, Blunt Rochester, Booker, Coons, Durbin, Fetterman, Gallego, Hassan, Heinrich, Kane, Kim, Lujan, Reed, Rosen, Schatz, Shaheen, Slotkin, and Smith. Mr. Cornyn, aye. Mr. Cruz, aye. Ms. Duckworth, no. Ms. Cantwell, no. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Ms. Cortez Masto, no. Mr. Peters, no. Ms. Ernst, aye. Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Wyden, no. Mr. Cotton, aye. Mr. Crapo, aye. Mr. Daines, aye. Mr. King, no. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mrs. Hyde-Smith, aye. Mrs. Blackburn, aye. Ms. Warren, no. Mrs. Britt, aye. Mr. Welch, no. Mr. Rounds, aye. Mr. Hickenlooper, no. Mr. Kelly, no. Mrs. Moody, aye. Mr. Langford, aye. Mr. Wicker, aye. Mr. Cassidy, aye. Mr. Warner, no. Mr. Sanders, no. Mr. Schiff, no. Mr. Whitehouse, no. Mr. Marshall, aye. Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Warnock, no. Thank you. Mr. Schumer, no. Mrs. Murray, no. Mr. Merkley, no. Mr. Graham, aye. Mr. Markey, no. Mr. Blumenthal, no. Mr. Grassley, aye. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, aye. Mr. Ossoff, no. Mr. Padilla, no. Ms. Klobuchar, no. Mrs. Gillibrand, no. Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Schmidt, aye. Mr. Van Hollen, no. Mr. Budd, aye. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Ms. Lummis, aye. Mr. Young, aye. Ms. Hirono, no.
On this vote, the yeas are 53, the nays are 47. The motion is agreed to. The clerk will report the nomination.
Department of Health and Human Services, Robert F. Kennedy, Jr. of California to be Secretary.
Mr. President.
Senator from Oregon, sorry.
Mr. President, as we begin this discussion that is so important to America, I thought I would just mention the conversation I had recently with a couple of young medical students who came up to me and said, you know, we know you're interested in health care and have been involved in this, and I'm so appreciative of Senator Murray, who's going to pick up on the health care issue, an area where she has very substantial experience and expertise. And I thought these medical students summed up this debate because they said, the way we see this Kennedy nomination, it's not just a vote for next week or even next year. This is a vote with enormous impact for decades because Mr. Kennedy, according to these young students, these young medical students, has a long record of essentially being anti-science. And what we're going to do in our discussion of his nomination is go into that and other issues. And suffice it to say, during his confirmation hearings, and they've been in multiple committees now, he was given ample opportunity from members on both sides of the dais to clarify his views on science and vaccines and our nation's biggest federal health programs. And we're going to, in the hours ahead, touch on each of these and why Mr. Kennedy's failure to demonstrate a basic understanding of these important issues that impact America's health make him a uniquely unqualified nominee to become our nation's chief health care officer. And in beginning my remarks, Mr. President, I wanted to say that ever since my days with the Gray Panthers, I've always felt that health care is the most important issue. If you and your loved ones don't have your health, everything just goes by the board. So that just reinforces what these young medical students were saying about the decision we're going to make in future hours with respect to Mr. Kennedy. And I'm going to start with perhaps the most dangerous aspect of his long history, and that's his embrace and amplification of vaccine conspiracy theories. He's made a lucrative career out of sowing doubt in the minds of parents when it comes to vaccinating their kids. His, quote, nonprofit, the Children's Health Defense, is solely dedicated to peddling these conspiracies. You can even get merch. There are baby onesies, apparently, that read unvaxxed, unafraid, no vax, no problem. He's been the attorney of record on at least 5 cases against drug companies for their vaccines, which he didn't disclose to ethics officials and refused to answer questions about. He also refused to give up his 10% stake in any settlement agreements, instead passing them off to his son. And he refused to recuse himself from taking any actions that might affect his family's financial interest. A vaccine that has become routine for young people about 20 years ago is involved here, and since then, it's successfully cut cervical cancer rates into just a fraction of what they were before the drug came to market. All of this adds up to a future HHS secretary who stands to profit off undermining this vaccine and, as a result, raise cervical cancer rates. To quote my Republican colleague, Senator Cassidy, a physician, Mr. Kennedy is financially vested in finding fault with vaccines. He also played a big role in one of the most deadly measles outbreaks in recent history. In 2019, he traveled to Samoa and used his platform to promote his anti-vax agenda, taking aim at the measles vaccine. The vaccine rate in Samoa plummeted. By 2019, measles had torn through the entire population, making more than 5,700 people sick, and 80 people were killed, most of them young kids. During his confirmation hearing at the Senate Finance Committee, Mr. Kennedy told me, and I quote, "We don't know what was killing them," speaking about those 83 deaths. But just last week, the Director General of the Health of Samoa called this claim by Mr. Kennedy, and I quote here, "a total fabrication." So, Mr. President and colleagues, just put that in your thinking about this consideration. Mr. Kennedy saying that he didn't know what was killing these young people in Samoa, and the Director General of the Health of Samoa called Mr. Kennedy's claim a total fabrication. A recent analysis showed that Mr. Kennedy has made 114 separate appearances in the last 4 years where he took anti-vaccine views or spread misinformation about the efficacy of the vaccines. In 36 of these instances, Mr. Kennedy directly linked vaccines to autism. Instead of providing the committee with clarity or reassurances about his decades-long career peddling of vaccine conspiracies, what did Mr. Kennedy do? He dodged, he weaved, he bobbed, and gave no indication that as Health and Human Services Secretary, he would stand by settled science that surrounds vaccines. As HHS Secretary, Mr. Kennedy would have a huge amount of control over how vaccines are promoted and administered in our country. He could issue orders that discourage doctors from sharing information with parents and patients about life-saving vaccines. He could issue an order that discourages schools from talking about or even requiring vaccines. He could rubber stamp an executive order from Donald Trump that defunds the Centers for Disease Control, which is essentially the agency in charge of getting Americans up-to-date information about vaccines and when to get them. Just imagine you're a parent scrolling on Instagram or listening to a podcast. You hear this gentleman speaking passionately about the danger of vaccines. Maybe you do a bit of research, and lo and behold, you find this is the Secretary of Health and Human Services, America's chief healthcare guy. You think to yourself, This guy must know what he's talking about. Maybe he's right when he's questioning if vaccines are safe and effective. So the seed of doubt on vaccines gets planted. And then at your kid's next wellness exam, you decide not to get them their next round of vaccinations. A few months later, you're taking them on a trip to Disneyland, say for spring break, where countless other parents like you have heard the same medical advice from the same person, and you too decided against vaccinating your kids. It only takes one of those kids carrying a deadly disease like measles for an outbreak to begin. And pretty soon, after what was supposed to be the spring break trip of your dreams, your kid, sadly, is showing symptoms. What follows then is a slew of doctor's appointments, maybe even a stay in the hospital, sleepless nights, missed days of work and school, not to mention dread and fear for your child's very well-being. Meanwhile, countless other parents around the country that went on the same trip to Disneyland are now experiencing the same exact nightmare you are. Sowing the seed of doubt in the minds of just a few people can have massive consequences for communities across the country. And it is not hypothetical. Right now, there's a measles outbreak in Texas that sickened more than a dozen kids. The number of kindergartners showing up with an exemption for required vaccinations jumped to a record high last fall. The two facts are connected, and Mr. Kennedy and his allies can take the credit for it. Now, Mr. Kennedy is fond of saying he's not making recommendations about whether parents should vaccinate their kids. He's just asking questions and giving people choices. That's a slippery tactic used by conspiracy theorists to dodge any real responsibility for their words and actions, and it's absurd coming from somebody who's about to be confirmed for a job that is entirely about making recommendations. Mr. Kennedy is also fond of saying that if somebody shows him the science to prove he's wrong, well, then he'll apologize and retract his statements. But when somebody does show him the science proves him wrong, he just brushes it aside and basically will not accept it as fact. Once again, to quote my Republican colleague Bill Cassidy directly, to improve the health of Americans or undermine it, always asking for more evidence and never accepting the evidence that's there. That's why Bill Cassidy told Mr. Kennedy he was struggling with his nomination. So even Republicans like Senator Cassidy, someone I work with frequently on the Finance Committee and respect his opinion, he knows how dangerous this guy is. And it is not hyperbole to say that when Mr. Kennedy becomes Health and Human Services Secretary, if he does, and has control over how our government rolls out vaccines or make them available, I believe kids in America will die. And when disease rates for illnesses that have effective vaccines start to rise in states across the country, and hospitalizations and death tolls mount, my Republican colleagues are going to regret voting, if they do, for Mr. Kennedy today or early this morning. And when disease rates for illnesses that have effective vaccines start to rise in states across the country and death tolls, mount, again, we will see Republicans say, this is something that could have been prevented. What else should we have done? Republicans will be responsible for every child that dies as a result of not being vaccinated because it seems they care more about staying in the good graces of Donald Trump than they do about protecting the lives of kids. Again, this is something they will regret for years to come. Now, before we turn to Senator Murray's remarks, I'd just like to touch on Mr. Kennedy's stance on reproductive choice, an area where Senator Murray has been our leader for years and years in the Senate. In the lead up to and during his failed presidential campaign, Mr. Kennedy repeatedly claimed he supported a woman's right to make her own health care decisions. Less than a year ago, in an Instagram post on June 14th last year, he stated that he supports the emerging consensus in this country that abortion should be legal up to a certain number of weeks. Fast forward to his confirmation again at the Senate Finance Committee a few weeks ago. He was pressed repeatedly by Democrats about his stance on abortion. Instead of clarifying, Mr. Kennedy defaulted to a clearly rehearsed talking point that he repeated over and over again. Quote, I agree with President Trump. Every abortion is a tragedy. While that answer doesn't give us much clarity, it's certainly telling. Mr. Kennedy has a long history of changing his stance on healthcare issue after healthcare issue to whatever position benefits him at the moment, as long as it earns him power or it earns him a paycheck. As far as I can tell, Mr. Kennedy will believe, or at least pretend to believe, whatever you want him to. He's willing to give up his principles and all of his beliefs that women and mothers are better equipped to make their own healthcare decisions than politicians. And it's all about, as we've talked about on this floor, staying in Donald Trump's orbit of power. While Mr. Kennedy recites rehearsed talking points on the subject, this is an issue that has had real, deadly consequences for women, as Senator Murray has said again and again. Donald Trump spent his first term packing the Supreme Court with right-wing extremists willing to rip away the reproductive freedoms guaranteed to us under Roe versus Wade. In the wake of the Supreme Court's gutting Roe, millions of women living in red states have had their reproductive freedoms ripped away from them, all due to Donald Trump. In the years since the overturn of Roe, there have been countless headlines about the consequences of these abortion bans. Women bleeding out in parking lots or in emergency rooms because they were denied care. Women becoming infertile and losing their ability to have kids in the future because they couldn't get care. And in the very worst cases, women dying. So it should horrify every American that we don't actually know where Mr. Kennedy stands. The man who could become our nation's chief healthcare officer, we don't know where he stands on reproductive health, short of perhaps just saying he's a yes man for anything Donald Trump tells him to do. So I think at this point, Mr. President, I want to yield the floor to my friend and colleague from Washington State, because she knows so much about the challenge of ensuring that women's reproductive health services are being protected. And as Secretary of Health and Human Services, Mr. Kennedy could do so much damage to the well-being and health of women, and I'm very pleased to be able to yield the floor to her to discuss that and other pressing issues.
Mr. President.
Senator from Washington.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you to my colleague from Oregon who has very clearly stated why this nominee is not someone who should be holding the title of Secretary of Health and Human Services, and I appreciate all of his work on this and his wise words. I hope everyone heeds them. Mr. President, the American people are watching now with alarm because the vast majority of people know vaccines are safe, they're effective, they are life-saving. But we are now on the verge of confirming as our nation's highest health official, a man who has spent considerable time, money, and effort undermining that basic fact. A man who has abused his platform by refusing to acknowledge the well-established science that shows that vaccines are not linked to autism. Fear about that point, fueled by RFK Jr. and others peddling misinformation, is a leading reason that parents do not get their kids vaccinated against preventable, dangerous diseases. That is why elevating a man like RFK Jr. to lead HHS would be so dangerous. Just giving him any platform to spread vaccine doubt is dangerous, but to give him one of the biggest megaphones in the world, it is truly shameful that we even are debating this. My colleagues should know better. They actually do know better. They are looking the other way. They are choosing to pretend like it is in any way believable that RFK Jr. won't use his new power to do exactly the thing he has been trying to do for decades, undermine vaccines. Never mind the fact that CDC has already modified web pages with information about vaccines and other vital public health information, which a federal judge has now ordered the Trump administration to restore it. Never mind that the Trump administration is also reportedly planning widespread and significant layoffs at CDC and across HHS. This is how RFK Jr. substitutes his own beliefs for science. So when the vaccine conspiracy starts swirling and RFK Jr. turns HHS into ground zero for misinformation, I had no idea it is not going to be an excuse for confirming him, because at the Health Committee hearing, the chair pressed him repeatedly about the debunked claim that vaccines cause autism. And when RFK Jr. said he needed to see the evidence, he was shown the evidence. But to no one's surprise, he did not keep his word, admit he'd been wrong, and spread the good news that vaccines do not cause autism. He's had 2 weeks since that hearing to look at the same settled science as everyone else. Crickets. But he won't hesitate to quote the latest anti-vax conspiracy. He's totally up to speed on that front. Are my colleagues really buying this guy will take an impartial look at the science? If you think RFK Jr. will change who he is, you are lying to yourself. He has given no evidence to suggest that and all the evidence in the world to the contrary. Given his long and growing track record, we cannot just pretend if RFK Jr. finally gets power to undermine vaccines, a cause he has dedicated a considerable amount of time and effort to, that he'll just give up. That is not believable. And I know I've been talking a lot about vaccines because it is so obviously alarming. But the responsibility he would have goes far beyond that. So let's break some of this down. Both the ways he could undermine vaccines as HHS secretary and the other responsibilities that would be at stake. To start with, the CDC is under HHS. That means that the secretary directly appoints people to CDC's Vaccine Advisory Board. That board is responsible for making recommendations about vaccines, and it is those recommendations that determine whether or not certain vaccines have to be covered by insurance. So simply put, changing those recommendations will change what vaccines millions of Americans, including kids, will be able to get from their healthcare provider. If he is confirmed, there would be nothing stopping RFK Jr. from firing the entire board and replacing them all with vaccine skeptics. After all, he has said many times and in many ways, he thinks CDC is corrupt and bought by pharma, as usual, by the way, without any evidence. RFK Jr. would also oversee the Food and Drug Administration. That is another agency he has repeatedly tried to discredit and attack, where he says he plans to fire hundreds of scientists on day one, and an agency that plays the crucial role of making sure our drugs and our treatments, including vaccines, are safe and effective when we purchase them. Not only would Mr. Kennedy have a key perch from which he would undermine vaccines on a scale like never seen before, he could also use that platform to peddle quack treatments, no basis in science. RFK Jr. would also have jurisdiction over NIH. That alone means influence over billions of dollars in medical research, research that is responsible for a significant portion of our economy, and more importantly, research that patients are desperately hoping will help them find cures. But RFK Jr. could redirect those funds to promote his favorite pet conspiracies instead of promising cures. Or he could make good on his plan to fire hundreds of researchers and pause infectious disease research for 8 years. It should go without saying, viruses aren't going to take a break. And here's the thing, the attacks on medical research are now already happening under Trump. From his day one executive orders, President Trump has already been threatening medical research. Suddenly, all of our grants are at risk because they are looking at addressing barriers to care or understanding why Black and Native American women have higher maternal death rates. And now President Trump also is trying to illegally, arbitrarily, and suddenly change NIH guidelines to set an unrealistic low cap on indirect cost rates. That will mean researchers laid off, studies canceled, including life-saving clinical trials, and kids not able to get the treatment they need. All because President Trump and Elon Musk don't seem to understand how we actually fund important research. and couldn't even be bothered to find out before taking an axe to our medical research labs. At a time when life-saving research like this is already under attack from President and the richest man in the world, no one who truly values medical research should vote to install one of the biggest attackers of medical science as the Secretary of Health and Human Services. Mr. President, insurance is another huge portfolio for HHS. Last time Trump was in office, we saw millions of people lose their health care coverage. The uninsured rate went up after years of hard-won progress. And we all know he still wants to rip up the Affordable Care Act, which will drive up costs and kick people off their coverage. There's no reason to think Mr. Kennedy will stand up to that effort. Indeed, there is no reason to think he has the experience and understanding of the system to actually do so. During his committee hearings, RFK Jr. confused Medicare and Medicaid. This is basic stuff. He failed to describe the components of Medicare. And yes, Mr. President, I do absolutely have to talk about abortion care. This is of grave importance right now. In his hearings, not only did RFK Jr. confess to having no real understanding of EMTALA, that is a law which requires patients have access to life-saving emergency care, including, in some cases, abortion care. He also showed that he will be totally open to Republicans' fact-free efforts to rip away access to medication abortion. Like so many other issues that RFK Jr. is simply wrong about, the science on that has been settled for many years now. Mr. Kennedy made clear, though, he's very open to revisiting access to the abortion pill based on a Republican argument against the science that basically boils down to nah. Putting up barriers to accessing the abortion pill or ripping it off the market completely, as Republicans have made very clear they want to do, would be absolutely devastating. And let's not forget about pandemic threats. The lies that RFK Jr. spread during the last pandemic already make clear he is not the man to do this job. But if that weren't enough, when there was a pandemic threat response planning session for this new administration, he skipped it. He didn't go. It would be almost comical if this wasn't so serious. Mr. President, everywhere you look, everything about this nominee is so concerning. We cannot take this man at his word, something he has changed and gone back and forth on time and time again. But we can take him on his record, which is that he has consistently undermined vaccine confidence. And by the way, note, he profited from that. And we can take the threat of what he might do seriously, especially given the alarming things that are already happening. If RFK Jr. gives you his word of honor that he won't freeze research, guess what? We're already seeing the Trump administration totally upend medical research. Thanks to the Trump funding freeze, NIH hasn't issued any grants award in weeks. If RFK Jr. swears that he's not going to take down information about vaccines, he's not going to silence experts, well, don't look now. But the Trump administration has already taken down or changed CDC pages about vaccines. They have already silenced public health experts. If RFK Jr. pinky promises you that he won't undermine medical science or studies or he won't ignore global health threats, well, you might want to sit down for this, but President Trump has completely demolished our global health aid work. He has already completely demolished it. The fallout is utterly heart-wrenching. Already we know of a woman who died because the USAID-supported hospital she went to for oxygen was forced to discharge her because they got a stop work order from the Trump administration. It's not clear if she was the first death caused by Trump's complete freeze, but there is no question she will not be the last. And Mr. President, let me make a really important point here. It is not just people across the world who will be affected by this. There was a study being done on a new HIV treatment with thousands of volunteers. Study being done, already having 1,000 volunteers doing the treatment. But now, without their regular injections, which are cut off by Trump's move, there's going to be too little of the drug in their system to protect those people from HIV, but enough of the drug that if they contract HIV, it could mutate to become drug resistant. So for all the absolutely unhinged conspiracies we've heard about medical research from RFK Jr. and the like, where is the concern of this actual risk in this actual study happening right now, all because President Trump cut off foreign assistance? RFK Jr. has been silent about that risk, silent about how wrong that is. And so even as he is making these empty promises on one hand to some of our colleagues, he's already standing by as President Trump breaks them on the other hand. Oh, and here's one more. If RFK Jr. says he's going to consult you on healthcare personnel, please do not be fooled. Look, I don't know why my colleagues need me to tell them this. I like to think we have some pretty smart people around here. But this vote, RFK Jr.'s own nomination, this is your consultation on healthcare personnel, not some made-up promise for later. This is the point you have the most power. Whatever he might say, you don't get to choose who RFK Jr. will appoint to this or that. Heck, he doesn't get to choose who President Trump appoints. The decision you get to make, all of us on this floor get to make, is the decision before us right now. You get to choose who you vote to confirm, and you will have to live with that decision. And if you ignore the warning signs and confirm RFK Jr., then when the wheels fall off the wagon, you may try to tell yourself you were lied to, but you knew who you were dealing with. You knew who you were dealing with. You knew what he said before and what he has refused to say. You had all the knowledge you needed to do the right thing. I cannot tell my colleagues enough, this is not a game. This is not a political role without consequence. The health secretary has real power over whether Americans can get basic information and care that impacts whether they live or die. As I have tried to drive home throughout this process, vaccines save lives. That is not a question. It is not a slogan. It is a fact. If when parents look to you, worried about their newborn, wanting to do what is best for their baby, and trusting your advice as a public health leader, if you cannot tell them the same truth that centuries of science and experience tells us, which is that vaccines are safe and effective and life-saving, then you have absolutely no business leading the Department of Health and Human Services, none. And so just as I did at the hearing, I want to warn all of my colleagues, by merely voting to confirm Mr. Kennedy, we would be telling our constituents he's worth listening to on vaccines. That alone will get people killed before he even lifts a finger, because he does not even need the levers of power to get people killed. All he needs is that megaphone. To affirm his views by voting to confirm him as our highest health official, let's not mince words about what that will mean. When babies die from whooping cough because parents weren't sure if the vaccine was safe, will you be able to look them in the eye? When the flu sweeps our nursing homes, when measles sweep through our communities, will it be worth it? Mr. President, I will end on this. I'm sure there are plenty of members who know perfectly well just how dangerous it would be to confirm RFK Jr. They don't need to hear it from me. In fact, some of them even know the danger better than I do. But here's what I do know. Conscience is a muscle. Courage is a muscle. The less you use them, the more they fade away. So if my colleagues are feeling the pressure from President Trump, or if they're feeling the weight of the richest man in the world on their backs on this vote, I would warn them. This will certainly not be the last test we face here in the Senate. Giving into this pressure now won't make it go away. It won't soften the pressure you face later, and it will not strengthen your resolve when the stakes are higher. It will just show pressure works. If you do not draw a line somewhere, you will cross every line you could ever imagine. You will be pushed further and further into accepting things you thought you never would, things you thought you never could. I think most of my colleagues know what really is at stake here. I think most of my colleagues know what sort of man RFK Jr. is and what sort of damage he could do if he's confirmed. There are political realities, we all get that, but there is also right and wrong. There's fact and fiction. There's people staying healthy and people dying pointlessly, kids dying pointlessly from diseases that we can prevent because they thought Congress took its job vetting our health care secretary seriously. So, Mr. President, I urge my colleagues to show some courage. I urge them to show some conscience. I urge them to vote no on RFK Jr.'s nomination. Mr. President, I yield 30 minutes of post-cloture debate time to the Democratic leader, and I yield the floor.
Senator from Tennessee.
Thank you.